MS Now's Fallon Gallagher was inside that courtroom. Also here, Rachel Van Landingham, retired lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Air Force, former JAG, and professor of law at Southwestern Law School. Good to have both of you there. So, Fallon, take us inside that courtroom. What stood out to you in these arguments?
Yeah, Chris, the key question during today's arguments was really whether those First Amendment restrictions that can apply to active duty service members also apply to retirees like Senator Kelly. Now, at this point, a lower court has preliminarily ruled that they do not apply. And this Court of Appeals, this three-court panel, a majority of them appear inclined to side with that lower court and with Senator Kelly. Now, Hegseth and the Pentagon have argued that those restrictions do apply, that the senator engaged in, that he was counseling disobedience, in their words, when he engaged in that video where he told service members that they can refuse to obey illegal orders. Now, Senator Kelly has said that the Department of Defense is acting in what they're calling textbook retaliation. And I want you to take a listen to what he had to say outside of court.
According to them, anytime a retired veteran says something that the Secretary of Defense doesn't like, they can be punished. So the people who have given the most in service to this country wouldn't be free to say what they believe. It's absurd and it's outrageous. It is an outrageous violation of our constitutional rights.
Now, inside the courtroom, the judges had really sharp questionings for the Department of Justice. One of the judges repeatedly reminded him that at West Point and the Naval Academy, it is textbook teaching to all cadets that you can refuse illegal orders. That was a current that came throughout this entire hearing. And there was another interesting line of questioning towards the end where one of the judges, one of the sharpest questioners during the entire hearing, had a line of questioning to the Department of Defense's attorney, where she asked him repeatedly if the senator wants to be able to speak freely and practice his First Amendment rights, would he have needed to discharge himself from the military as opposed to retire? And the Department of Defense attorney couldn't answer that question in a straight way that satisfied the judge. Now, there was no ruling from here today, but we expect a written opinion in the coming weeks. Chris?
Thank you so much for that. Well, Rachel, Senator Kelly told Punchbowl News, quote, "My expectation is we win in the circuit court, and I also expect them to probably appeal again, and it might go to the Supreme Court." Based on what you heard today, what do you think?
Well, I think Senator Kelly is right. I do think there's a strong chance this will go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will resoundingly side with Senator Kelly and the millions of military retirees like me that maintain our First Amendment right to speech. Senator Kelly is a mere pensioner, as the Supreme Court has called military retirees, receiving pay for his past service. So while military members do have restricted First Amendment liberties while on active duty, of course, because of the nexus to good order and discipline and obedience to command, military retirees are civilians who enjoy the panoply of First Amendment protections, and they should. We need to hear from our veterans. And what the Secretary of Defense is trying to do now really risks chilling the speech of millions of individuals who have honorably served their country.
So indeed, Rachel, central to today's argument, what this ruling could mean for military retirees. And if the judge sides with the Defense Department and Secretary Hegseth, you mentioned the chilling effect it could have on free speech. But for people who believe it's important for them to stand up for what they believe in, automatically they lose their rank and pay?
Well, the Secretary of Defense would have to go through some kind of procedure, such as the Uniform Code of Military Justice, military criminal law, technically does still apply to military retirees like myself.
Some kind of religious endeavor for the United States. How do you respond to that? How do you think that impacts the mission?
Well, yeah, I mean, I responded in an article in the New Republic just the other day about this. And, hey, I've never heard a Secretary of Defense say things like this. I don't think it's appropriate. You know, I'm Catholic, as a person of faith, you know, this isn't the way that, you know, war fighters should be thinking about a mission that the government asks them to be on. And I find it pretty objectionable that the Secretary of Defense is trying to intertwine religion with combat operations on the other side of the planet. We put these service members at significant risk. What the government should be doing and saying is giving the American people a coherent rationale for why we are in this conflict and how it helps them. I don't see how this helps the American people afford their rent and groceries and gasoline. Those things are all going to go up because Donald Trump went into this without a strategic plan, with no vision, with no goal, with no timeline, and no exit strategy.
Senator, as you know, the United States military has moved significant assets to the region. Donald Trump is casually talking about sending in ground troops, perhaps to take over Karg Island. Do you view that, given your experience and what you know, as a threat, a negotiating tactic, or are you concerned there may be American troops on the ground in Iran?
Yeah, Willie, I'm really concerned about putting troops on the ground. It is just going to put those individuals at significant risk of losing their lives. This isn't even like conflict with Iraq. You know, this is a much more significant fighting force that we would be up against. When you consider just, thousands of Marines and maybe special operations forces taking an island, it will be challenging, to do that and to hold that territory. And again, I get back to why. Like, what is the goal of taking Karg Island? Is it just that it's a asset of the Iranians and we're back into just taking other countries' stuff? The real mission now needs to be, how do you get the Strait of Hormuz open? 20% of the world's oil runs through there, and because of Donald Trump's poor decision making in going to war against the Iranians, we've got a big problem that now has to be solved. I would suggest that this administration really thinks hard and comes up with a plan, like a rational plan, on how do you extract yourself from a situation that you created. They went into this with no goal, right? They said it was about regime change, and then it was about nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, the Navy. Donald Trump had a feeling. I also heard imminent threat of something in the future. That's not strategy. And the worst thing that could happen at this point.
Let's go to the region with MS Now contributor Inzamam Rashid in Dubai, plus our military analyst, General Barry McCaffrey, and former Arab-Israeli negotiator Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Inzamam, it has been another 24 hours of mixed messages from the U.S., Iran, and Pakistan regarding negotiations. Where do things stand right now?
Yeah, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of rhetoric, but behind the scenes, there is a lot of diplomacy as well. And I think that's a positive sign. Look, currently we're in a situation where President Trump has yet dealt another ultimatum. He said to Iran, come to the table with this proposal that we have given you, or else we will bomb you once again, and at levels a lot higher than previously. Iran is now currently reviewing this US proposal that was handed to them. And it's my understanding from Pakistanis today that Iran will give some form of response to that proposal if they haven't done so already. Well, what's inside this is something we discussed yesterday, Anna, but some more details have been emerging as a result of what's inside this proposal that the US has put forward. And a lot of it is actually around Iran's nuclear program. There's some very kind of specific details in there around whether Iran can or cannot enrich uranium, whether the US actually takes control of that uranium as well. But then there's the whole crux of this proposal is that this conflict ends within the next 30 days, that they come to some form of conclusive ending to the war, and that the Strait of Hormuz fully opens, that Iran's sanctions that have been put on them by the US are unfrozen. But if the ceasefire is broken within the next 30 days, or there is no negotiation essentially between the two countries, then the US will carry out their aggression and continue their blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. So currently, the ball is now back in Iran's court. They have got the ball there to try and make the decision essentially, and what their response will be to this US proposal. I don't think that they will fully comply and agree with what the US has put on the table. They'll go back with their own options. And I think we're kind of in this bit of a state of abeyance right now where the back and forth continues, and actually getting the two sides in the room together to have the discussions is the key goal, but it's looking very difficult in terms of getting there.
Meantime, nothing's really getting through the Strait of Hormuz. General McCaffrey, according to the Pentagon, more than 22,000 mariners are stranded on more than 1,500 commercial ships in the Persian Gulf right now. Will anything short of a comprehensive peace deal get that traffic moving?
Probably not. Both Mr. Trump and the Iranians have enormous economic and military arguments why they should stop fighting. I think the Iranians probably can't keep it up more than 60 to 90 days with a U.S. counter blockade. They're going to run out of money to pay the IRGC, among other things. And I think Mr. Trump's watching both his political and economic fortunes being grievously affected by this. That Operation Freedom was a test to see if the Iranians would blink and allow us to use minimal U.S. naval assets to break the Iranian blockade. It didn't work. That was a contested passage. Those were two destroyers with enormously courageous U.S. sailors, tremendous technology. It was an air-sea operation. They destroyed 6 Iranian fast boats. They managed to...
Something just happened in Washington that Donald Trump probably never expected to see. Not Democrats, not the media, not even a handful of Republican critics. We're talking about a wave of resistance that is suddenly becoming impossible to ignore. And if you're wondering why this story is making so many people nervous, the answer is simple. Because for the first time in a long time, the conversation isn't about what Trump wants to do. It's about whether the people around him are finally willing to say no. And honestly, that may be the biggest threat Trump has faced since returning to power. Think about it. For months, we've heard the same argument over and over again. Trump is the commander-in-chief. Trump sets the agenda. Trump makes the decisions. But what happens when military leaders, lawmakers, veterans, judges, and even members of his own government start pushing back? What happens when people begin openly discussing the possibility that some orders should not be followed at all? That's where this story becomes much bigger than a normal political fight. Because now we're talking about the limits of presidential authority itself. And let's be honest, that's a conversation Trump never likes having. The controversy exploded around Senator Mark Kelly and his comments reminding military personnel that they are not required to obey illegal orders. Now stop for a second and think about how strange it is that this even became controversial. Every military officer in America learns that principle. It's taught at military academies. It's taught in officer training. It's one of the foundations of lawful military service. Yet somehow, reminding service members about that responsibility triggered outrage from Trump's allies and sparked an effort that critics describe as retaliation. And that's where people started asking a very uncomfortable question. Why would anyone be upset by the idea that illegal orders should be refused? Seriously. Why? If nobody plans on giving illegal orders, then why does this issue suddenly become such a threat? That's the part many Americans can't stop thinking about. Because the reaction seems bigger than the statement itself, much bigger. According to reports discussed during the legal proceedings, the argument from Trump's allies is that retired military personnel should still face restrictions when they speak publicly on these issues. But critics say that's absurd. They argue that retirees are civilians who retain their constitutional rights and should be free to express concerns without fear of punishment. And when judges started questioning government lawyers, some of those answers apparently didn't go over very well. In fact, several observers came away with the impression that the government's position was facing serious skepticism. Now, maybe that's not surprising. After all, Americans generally don't react positively when they think free speech is being threatened, especially when that speech comes from decorated veterans who spent decades serving their country. But this story doesn't stop there. Not even close. Because while the courtroom battle was unfolding, another debate was getting louder. the debate over Trump's handling of the growing conflict with Iran. And this is where things start getting really explosive. Critics argue that Trump entered this situation without a clear objective, without a clear timeline, and without a clear exit strategy. Those are serious accusations. Some military experts have openly questioned what the endgame actually is. Others are asking why American forces would risk becoming more deeply involved in a conflict that could spiral far beyond anyone's control. And if you've been paying attention to recent interviews, you've probably noticed something interesting. The people raising these concerns aren't all coming from one political side. Some of them have military backgrounds. Some have national security experience. Some spent years serving in positions where decisions like these carried life and death consequences. That's why their warnings are attracting attention. They're not talking about campaign slogans. They're talking about war, real war, the kind that costs lives, drains resources, and creates consequences that last for generations. And here's where the story takes another turn. While Trump continues talking tough, diplomatic negotiations appear to be happening behind the scenes. Proposals are being exchanged, deadlines are being discussed, foreign governments are involved, military assets remain positioned throughout the region, and according to multiple analysts, nobody seems entirely sure what happens next. That's not exactly reassuring. In fact, uncertainty may be the biggest problem of all, because markets hate uncertainty, allies hate uncertainty, military planners hate uncertainty, and ordinary Americans definitely hate uncertainty when it could eventually affect gas prices, inflation, jobs, and economic stability back home. That's why this issue matters even to people who normally ignore foreign policy. The consequences don't stay overseas forever. They eventually show up at home. And that's where Trump may be facing a growing political problem. Because voters are usually willing to tolerate bold decisions if they understand the objective. But when people start asking what the goal actually is and nobody can provide a clear answer, support can disappear surprisingly fast. We've seen it happen before. History is full of leaders who believed public support would last indefinitely until suddenly it didn't. That's why some observers think the real battle isn't happening in courtrooms or even in the Middle East. They think it's happening in the minds of voters who are trying to decide whether this administration actually has a coherent strategy. And right now, a lot of people seem unconvinced. Then there's another question that nobody wants to answer directly. What happens if more military leaders begin speaking out? What happens if more veterans publicly challenge decisions coming from the administration? What happens if judges continue siding against efforts to silence critics? Because once that process starts, it's very difficult to stop. The more pressure applied against dissenting voices, the more attention those voices often receive. It's one of the oldest rules in politics. Attempts to suppress criticism frequently create even more criticism. And that's why this entire situation feels like it could be approaching a turning point. Maybe Trump's allies are right and these concerns are being exaggerated. That's possible. Maybe the courts eventually side with the administration. That's possible too. But what if neither side gets exactly what they want? What if this controversy keeps growing? What if more questions emerge? What if more officials start pushing back? Suddenly, the story becomes much larger than one senator, one lawsuit, or one news cycle. It becomes a test of whether power still has limits. And judging by the intensity of the reactions we're seeing, that's exactly what many people believe is happening right now. So keep watching carefully. Watch the court decisions. Watch the military response. Watch the negotiations with Iran. And most importantly, watch how politicians react when they're asked the simplest question of all. If everything is under control, why does it feel like so many people inside the system are sounding the alarm? Because the answer to that question may determine where this story goes next. And if you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand the battles happening behind the scenes before the rest of the media catches up, stick with Pump Politics, because the most important political stories usually start long before everyone else realizes what's really happening.